Our next witness wishes to be known as Mary, does she?
Yes, sir.
Mary, please.
Please state your full name.
Mary Evelyn Grindley.
Please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Mary, you're here to talk about your late husband, John,
That's right.
who had severe haemophilia A.
That's right.
And we're going to put a picture of John on the screen. Henry, it's 2336018, please. Was that your wedding day?
It was, yes.
And we're going to leave that picture on the screen apart from when we have documents up. So you met John first of all when you were at Teacher Training College.
That's right, yes.
And he was the brother of a friend of yours.
That's right, yes. I was at a teacher's training college in North London, and I was a friend of John's sister. Do you want me to elaborate?
Well, I think it was you met him a few times over the following years, but you didn't start going out together until a few years later in the mid-1970s.
Yes, I became a family friend. I first met John when I went to South East London, where he lived with John's sister, and it was actually the Romans that brought us together because we went to, I went with John's sister to a lecture about the Romans at Horniman's Museum in South East London, and history was my main subject at college.
And you stayed in touch with the family, you became a family friend,
Yes.
and it was a few years later in the mid-1970s you and John started going out.
Yes, it was mainly after John's sister got married and left home.
And you, the two of you got engaged in 1977.
That's right.
On the Silver Jubilee Day.
That's right, yes.
And you married the following year in Suffolk, which was where you were from.
Yes.
Just want to ask you a little about John's life before the two of you met. He'd spent a lot of his childhood in Evelina Children's Hospital in London.
He had, yes. He lost a lot of schooling because of his haemophilia, and I think his education suffered quite a bit.
But there then came a time when he went to Trelawn's College.
That's right, yes.
And he became head boy.
He became head boy. I think it was because he was the oldest. I think that was in 1971, 72.
And he recalled that as a happy time.
He did. He enjoyed it very much, yes. I was talking recently to some old boys from Trelawn's, and they were talking about the camaraderie that they had there, despite their difficulties.
And he was able to do some City and Guilds qualifications in electronics engineering,
Yes,
despite the
yes.
amount of school he'd missed.
He passed his sitting Guilds in electronics engineering.
Now, when you'd first met John, he'd been in a wheelchair because he'd had some form of surgery to his legs.
No, he was in his wheelchair because of his haemophilia, the deterioration of the joints. But I don't know much about, but he had some kind of operation which I considered quite a miracle, really. He was able to walk much more than he had done. He could not bend his knees. When we got married, he couldn't kneel down at the altar, but he could walk much better than he had been previously.
And you say in your statement you were drawn to him in particular because of his strength of character.
Yes,
And you observe many haemophiliacs that you've met over the years have tremendous strength.
yes, and I would like to pay tribute to each and every one of you here because, yes, I think it is, because they've had to fight for all that their treatment and financial things.
Up until the mid-1970s, John was receiving cryoprecipitate as his main treatment.
Sorry, could you repeat the date?
Yes, up until about 1976, as we'll see from some correspondence,
Yes.
John had been receiving cryoprecipitate, but he was one of the first then to move on at St Thomas's to factor VIII concentrate and home treatment.
Yes, he was very eager to get onto home treatment.
And we'll just have a look at a letter from early 76. Henry, it's 2336021, please. We can see it's dated the 21st of January 1976. It's addressed to John's GP, and it says this: "We are at last receiving sufficient supplies of freeze..." I'm sorry, Mary, are you able to follow it?
Yes, I'm fine, thank you.
We are at last receiving sufficient supplies of freeze-dried factor VIII concentrate to be able to offer to suitable haemophiliacs the material and equipment to treat their own bleeding episodes at home. This has come to be widely regarded as an improvement in the management of the ordinary run of episodes of haemophilic bleeding. I have been reviewing the haemophiliacs who attend here, and I think that Mr Grindley would be suitable for this form of management." And the here was the haemophilia centre at St Thomas's Hospital by this time.
Yes, that's right.
The letter continues: "We would see that Mr Grindley had sufficient understanding of his disorder to know when he should give himself a treatment and how much he should give. We will teach him to perform his own venipunctures and to administer his doses. We would see that he understood the possible risks of intravenous therapy and that he made appropriate plans for the storage and disposal of his equipment. We would, of course, supply the treatment materials and the necessary syringes, needles, and so forth." And then it talks about the possibility of allergic reactions. Do you know what information was given to John about any risks of going on to this course of treatment?
Well, I wasn't actually married to him then, and I was teaching in Suffolk. I only saw him during, school holidays. Not that I know of.
No, don't worry. And then we're going to just look from the records and see the wide range of factor VIII products that John received over the years. Henry, could we have 2336009, please? And could we go to page 9, please? We can see here, this is an extract from the National Haemophilia Database records, and we see from 1969, there is a reference to 1969 John receiving factor VIII BPL, but then it's fresh frozen plasma or cryoprecipitate until we get to 1970. Then there's again some references to factor VIII BPL. And then we can see that John received a range of different products, including Co8, factor VIII, Profilate, and Cryobulin. And then, please, Henry, could we have page 16? The last page took us up to 1980, and we see on this page from 1980 onwards, again, we can see him receiving Cryobulin, we can see him receiving BPL factor VIII, Haemophil, Profilate, so a full range of different commercial products as well as the NHS product. But John was keen to use home treatment. He found it liberating.
Yes, he did, and he did improve. He was able to go out more and do more things. Yes, definitely.
And he was working by this time in a small electronics firm in South East London.
That's right, yes.
After you married, you moved to London to join him.
Yes, I possibly had the better job, but we wanted John to stay under St Thomas's, and Suffolk wouldn't have provided such good treatment.
You became pregnant and you had your son.
Yes.
And you talk about the relationship between John and your son in this way in your statement. You say there were things John couldn't do, like play football with him, but he did what he could and was a really good father to his son.
He was, yes.
And indeed, your son in his witness statement has said he was as good a dad as anybody could ask for. I've nothing but fond memories.
Good.
I wanted to ask you about a haemophilia society meeting that you and John attended.
Mhm.
And Henry, if we could have the photo back up on the screen, please. You say in your statement you think it was 1983 and it was an AGM of the Haemophilia
Yes, it was
Society.
April 1983.
And you remember it because news had broken of the first English haemophiliac to die from AIDS.
That's right, yes.
And you recount in your statement you stood up at the meeting and you asked what the implications might be in terms of being able to have other children because you desperately wanted a second
Yes,
child.
that's right.
And was there any response?
Yes, it was Dr. McFarland who was speaking, and he said basically, we don't know how AIDS is transmitted. Put everything on hold as far as having a second child.
And you and John went home and you discussed it and you decided you couldn't take the risk of having a second child.
No, that's right.
And you decided not to have a physical relationship from that point onwards.
That's right, yes.
You say in your statement the thought of no more children nearly broke you.
It did. I remember an incident. We lived in a small flat and my mother-in-law had brought a pram for my son, and we asked her if she could take it away and sell it because there would be no more children, and it nearly broke me.
And you say from that day onwards you and John changed your lifestyle in other respects. He would use his own towel, crockery,
Yes.
crockery cutlery and the like.
Yes.
You think that was the first you'd heard of AIDS or HTLV3, but you say in your statement you had been aware, and John had been aware of problems of infection with hepatitis prior to that.
You're talking about non-A, non-B?
Yes.
Yes. I think John was well aware before we got married that he had non-A, non-B.
And you remember, your statement says, writing indeed to Ronald Reagan in 1980 about that.
That's right, yes.
Because you were concerned about American blood
Yes.
as long ago as 1980.
Yes, that's right.
And you wrote to Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister, in 1981.
Yes.
And you have said this. Oh, sorry, we'll see the response, actually. 2336007, please, Henry. And we can see it's a letter of the 16th of March of 1981 from the Department of Health and Social Security to you. Dear Mrs Grindley, thank you for your letter of the 12th of February addressed to the Prime Minister about Factor 8. I've been asked to reply. I'm sorry I've not been able to do so earlier. The National Blood Transfusion Service, including the Blood Products Laboratory, was the subject of an adjournment debate on the 15th of December. In his reply, a copy of which I enclose, Sir George Young spoke about the need to redevelop the Blood Products Laboratory, which manufactures a range of blood products for the NHS, including Factor 8 for the treatment of haemophiliacs. However, Sir George emphasised that it is not possible to redevelop overnight a facility as complex as that laboratory. A number of issues are involved, for example, funding, technology and plasma supply, and it will necessarily be several years before redevelopment can be completed. Planning has already begun, however, and although I cannot yet say how soon it will be possible to start building, I can assure you that ministers are very much aware of the need for the new laboratory. You have asked Mrs Thatcher to stop the import of Factor 8 from abroad. May I say that I can understand your feelings, but I am afraid that this is simply not possible at present. However, the upgrading programme described by Sir George will enable the Blood Products Laboratory to double its output of Factor 8 by the end of next year, though it will still be necessary for health authorities to purchase some Factor 8 commercially. So we can see from that in early 1981 you were sufficiently knowledgeable about and concerned about the risks of American products to write to central government. And that was the response that you received.
Yes.
You continued to write on this particular issue to
Yes.
politicians over the years. And there's a letter we'll pick up in 1987. Henry, it's the same exhibit number, 2336007, but it's page 7, please. We can see from this, it's just the last page of a letter.
Yes, I've lost the rest of it. I don't know where it is.
And that's your handwriting at the bottom.
My
Lost
very
the first
scribbled,
part
yes.
of this letter. It's very legible, but this ending is important. And the ending of the letter from Lord Skelmersdale was this: "We have fully financed the new 60 million BPL at Elstree to ensure the earliest possible completion date. The new factory was opened on 29 April 1987. Production is expected within the next few months, leading to very substantial production next year and self-sufficiency in all blood products by 1989. So we can see, although we don't know the date of this letter, it obviously post-dates April 1987, and it's the same issue that you'd picked up on back in 1981. You and John read what you could about AIDS and tried to inform yourself about the situation.
That's right, yes.
And we can see that John raised concerns with your MP in late 1983. And we'll have a look at 2 letters, Mary. Henry, it's page 3 of this exhibit, please. So, this is a letter from your MP, written at John's behest to Kenneth Clarke, then Minister of State in the Department of Health and Social Security. It's dated the 2nd of November 1983. And it says, "Dear Kenneth, Mr. Grindley is a constituent of mine who came to see me. He suffers from haemophilia and as a result has to have regular blood transfusions. He is very concerned about the spread of AIDS, particularly as apparently the United Kingdom imports most of its blood products from the United States. The particular ingredient which he requires, factor 8, the clotting factor, is, I understand, imported mainly from Alpha Therapeutic Corporation in California. As you know, there's been a serious spread of the AIDS problem in the United States, and it can be passed on by blood transfusions. Mr. Grindley tells me that another haemophiliac recently died of AIDS, which he acquired from a foreign
It must be blood.
Should be blood product. This seems to me to be a very serious problem, and I should be grateful if you could let me know what action the DHSS is taking to make sure that AIDS is not imported into the United Kingdom with foreign blood products. Is there any way of synthesising these products, and is there any programme to ensure that the United Kingdom is self-sufficient in blood products at some foreseeable time in the future?" And then he refers to enclosing some copies of newspaper articles which John had passed on to your MP. And we'll see the response to this letter. It's the next page, please, Henry. It's dated the 16th of December 1983, and it's from the Joint Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in the Department of Health. And it says this: "Thank you for your letter of the 2nd of November addressed to Kenneth Clarke about acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, and the supply of blood products in this country. I can well appreciate the anxiety, particularly amongst haemophiliacs and their families, which recent press reports on AIDS may have caused, and would first of all like to put matters into perspective. The cause of AIDS is as yet unknown, and there is no conclusive proof that the disease has been transmitted by American blood products. Nevertheless, I would like to assure your constituent that the government is committed to making this country self-sufficient in blood products. Over £2 million has already been spent on improving the production facilities of the Blood Products Laboratory at Elstree, Herts, and a major redevelopment programme is underway. When this is complete, the Central Blood Laboratories Authority will have a new laboratory of a size capable of meeting the demands of England and Wales for blood products. Meanwhile, in the absence of a satisfactory alternative, we shall be dependent upon imports from the USA for an adequate supply of factor 8. While there is as yet no test for AIDS, such imports prepared from plasma collected after March this year will be subject to new regulations initiated by the US Food and Drug Administration designed to exclude donors from high-risk groups, e.g. persons with symptoms and signs suggestive of AIDS, sexually active homosexual or bisexual men with multiple partners, intravenous drug abusers. Although future supplies of factor 8, both for export and for use in America, will be manufactured from plasma collected in accordance with these regulations, there is still a quantity of stock which has been made from pre-March plasma. The FDA has recently decided not to ban the use of such stocks because to do so would cause a crisis of supply. the same considerations apply here. We are, of course, anxious to minimise the possible risk of the transmission of AIDS by blood donation in this country. My department, in conjunction with regional transfusion directors, has issued a leaflet, AIDS and How It Concerns Blood Donors, which asks people from high-risk groups to refrain from giving blood. A copy is enclosed. I hope you find this useful. That was the response that you and John received to the concerns you'd raised about the spread of AIDS from blood products. Now, that we can see was late 1983, and you recall John having some kind of skin or patch test in November 1983.
Yes.
And we'll look at what happened to John's arm as a result. But before we do that, can you remember what the test comprised at all?
Well, I didn't actually go with John at the time. As far as I remember, it was like a prick test that you would have for allergies. And as you know, at this time there was no actual blood test for AIDS, as far as I know. And as far as I remember, it's a prick test on the arm, like you would. It was about 4 or 5 different pricks on the arm.
And we can see a photo of how John's arm responded. It's 2336028, please, Henry. So we can see there what happened to John's arm. And then could we go to the next page, please, and see what was written on the back of the photo? And there's a difference between the black and the blue ink here, and that has some significance in terms of when it was written.
Yes. In the blue was what I wrote on the back of the photograph when I took it in November 83. The rest of it in black is what I put on the photo for the inquiry.
So we can see that the date that it was November 83, and your understanding, yours and John's, was this was some form of AIDS reaction test.
Yes, in his notes it doesn't say AIDS, but that we called it an AIDS test.
And yours and John's understanding of the way in which John's skin reacted was that he was negative.
Yes, John explained it to me as that because his arm blew up, it meant he had good immunity at that time.
And we'll look at his clinical notes, 2336026, please, Henry. It's the entry at the very top of the page. If you could highlight the first 3 lines in yellow, please, Henry. We can see the words, thank you, HTLV test neg,
Yes.
22nd 1183 sample.
That's right.
So John's understanding that this was a negative and therefore a good result was shared by the clinician who made the entry in the records.
Yes, and can I make the point that I think the first sentence possibly refers to him giving blood, because he used to give blood for research. But what that research was, I don't know.
If the test for HTLV, HIV as it became, was not in operation in 1983, that's your understanding, this must have been something written in afterwards, referring to a sample taken on the 22nd of November.
I really can't say.
This is the form in which you've received this extract from his notes.
Yes.
Well, it must follow that if there was no test, and this is referring to, at the time, and this is referring to one, it must be looking at a sample retrospectively.
This test, when it says negative, it refers to the prick test.
The skin test.
The skin test.
I see.
That was Mary's and John's understanding at the time, that the skin test was the available test at the time, not a blood test.
Yes.
And this is the information that they were provided with, as I understand from Mary.
Thank you.
Your recollection in your witness statement, Mary, was that John was given a diagnosis of HIV in 1986.
Yes.
the records and diary entries that we've been able to look at subsequently suggest that it was probably 1985.
Yes, it's a bit confusing as to what happened.
Well, again, we'll just look at 2 or 3 documents to see what information there is in the records about dates. Henry, could we have, in fact, it's further down that page, could you highlight the entry for the 1st of April 1985, please? 1485.
Yeah, excuse me, I just can't see my glasses.
I'll wait till you've got your glasses back, Mary.
Thank you.
So we can see the date is the 1st of April 1985.
Thank you.
It refers to John being given Profilate, and then it says HTLV3 positive, serocom to discuss implications with patient. So that appears to be the positive HTLV3 result.
Yes.
But there is an entry in John's diary to suggest that what he was told in July of 1985 was that the test was negative. And we'll just look at that, 2336027. And if we could just, we can see the date. If we could just zoom in, please, on the 16th of July entry. Thank you. The date is July 1985. We can see a meticulous record here. Is this your writing or John's writing?
It's John's writing.
And we can see a record there of a bleed and the treatment that he received. And then the very bottom entry is got results from AIDS test, neg. So
Yes.
John's
About
understanding.
2 months later.
Yeah, John's understanding there. And we don't have any clinical records that show him being told of his diagnosis, but his understanding there was that it was negative.
Yes. I don't think he would lie. We had a very good relationship. I don't think he would have lied to me and put that in the diary if it wasn't true.
And we can see a later blood test in October 1985. Henry, that's 2336023, please. And we see this is a test for John. The serum date is 21st of October 1985. Antibodies to HTLV3 detected. And indeed, it was after that the records show that you yourself went to be tested too.
Yes, yes.
And had an anxious wait until the negative result came back. So whether it was April, July or October, in the course of that year, John and you learnt that he had been infected with HIV.
I'm not clear. I'm still not clear. My memory is gone. I've tried to put things in the back of my mind for many years, and this is a long time ago. John always said that he converted from negative to positive on heat-treated blood, but I don't know.
Well, don't worry about the precise dates, Mary, because the records themselves do not paint a clear or consistent picture.
But I can't remember when I went to have my tests whether we actually knew at that time or not.
Whatever the precise date, can you recall what information was provided to John about prognosis or treatment?
There again, my memory has gone. I mean, I think the general prognosis was only a few years, but I don't know what specific things were said to John. We certainly thought he wouldn't live very long.
Now, the two of you didn't tell many people of the diagnosis initially. You kept it to yourselves.
Yes.
And he was able to continue work, and he didn't, for a number of years, show signs of physical deterioration. So you tried to carry on as normal as best you could.
Well, yes. For the sake of our young son, we did, really.
It was in the early 1990s that John started to become seriously unwell.
That's right, yes.
We've got a couple of photos that show you and John together in the early 1990s. Henry, could we have first of all, please, 2336020? And we can see that's a picture of the two of you. Was that in your garden?
No, it was in a relative's, a friend's garden. And that was the summer before John died.
So that would have been 1993.
That's right, yes.
And then we have 2336019, please.
And that's, I think, more or less the last picture I've got of John. That was about, that was possibly about 4 months before he died.
When John became ill, he decided he would tell people, and he made a list of the people he needed to tell.
That's right.
And he just phoned them up and told them.
That's right, yes.
And you said that must have been incredibly difficult for him.
Well, yes, it was, yeah. But that was the way he was, that was what he was like. I don't know whether you're coming to it, but 2 years before he died, and he more or less, he was technically in work for the last 2 years of his life, because they very kindly paid him. But he gave up about 2 years before he died. And he actually went into the undertakers and he paid for his funeral plan, and subsequently he went in 2 or 3 times and actually told them what was wrong with him, so that I wouldn't have to deal with that when the time came. And also he thought of the undertakers themselves, that they knew what they were dealing with and how they could handle him.
And indeed, he planned the music and the poetry he wanted to have at his funeral.
Yes, we planned it all together.
He went to see the Reverend Tanner to ask him to conduct his funeral, which he agreed to do.
Yes.
And it was, at that point, you say this in your statement, it was when we were planning John's funeral that I remember him lying down on the couch and crying for the very first time.
Yes.
John was an incredibly strong person, and I never knew him to cry. It was totally out of character. He said, "I don't want to die."
And what do you say to somebody? What do you say?
You said, "I know
when
you
your partner's
don't."
dying like that, yeah, you don't know what to say, do you?
Before John had to give up work in 1992, he was starting to have to take time off work and was starting to look unwell.
Yeah.
So he took the decision to tell the managing director of the firm
That's right.
of his illness. And word got around.
Excuse me, I think they already knew because there had been incidents at work, which you may refer to.
Yes, well, we'll look at a couple of the examples you've given in your statement, Mary. Henry, could we have 2336006, please? We can see on the left-hand side, danger, watch out, it's a Mr. Grindley. And you've written on there, this is a copy of a notice put up on the wall at the electronics firm where he worked. And then if we have, please, the following page, page 3. Danger, government health warning. Mr. Grindley can seriously damage your health. Congratulations, you've just met HF headhunters.
HF is high frequency. It's an electronics term.
And again, that's a copy of a notice put up on the wall of the firm where John worked.
Yes. I think this was a prank. I don't think it was actually malicious, because John was well liked, but I really don't quite know the motivation. I think the management got to know about it. It was a small family firm, and it was soon taken down, and the firm were very good about it. But I do have another document, which you probably haven't got, where John actually had to sign to say that he was it was some kind of pass to get into the store where the electronics parts were that he needed for his work. So he had to sign this pass to say it was okay for him to come in. But I must say John's firm, were very, very good to him. Very, very good to him.
Now, you talk in your statement more generally about the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS.
Yes.
You said that you and John had to lie to people. Sometimes they became suspicious and you felt like second-class citizens.
That's right, yes.
And you've given a couple of examples in your statement of experiences you had with neighbours.
Yes.
One was where you were living in a house with 2 flats and there was a young couple who had somehow found out of John's condition, and the young woman upstairs came down the stairs with her child in the pushchair. You opened the doors at the same time and she suddenly shouted something to the effect, "Your husband's got AIDS, your husband's got AIDS."
John wasn't even positive then, so I don't know. Yes, she backed off, and I think that was the last I saw of her. She got a transfer.
And you've also described another time where you had a neighbour who was harassing you. You say she must have found out about John, and amongst other things, you saw her smash John's car window.
Yes.
Eventually, you were moved to a new house where you didn't have
Yes,
trouble.
and that was through the police, actually.
In 1987, early 1987, you saw in the press reported some comments made by Edwina Curry, then a junior health minister, when she had said at a meeting, "Good Christian people who wouldn't dream of misbehaving will not catch AIDS."
That's right.
You wrote to her about this, and we
did,
can
yes.
see the reply that you got at 2336002, page 2, please. It's dated the 23rd of March 1987, and it says this: "Dear Mrs. Grindley, Mrs. Curry has asked me to thank you for your letter of the 13th of February about her remarks on the 12th of February about AIDS. She has asked me to reply. I am sorry that you do not agree with what she said. We are very concerned about the dangers of AIDS. There is no cure or vaccine and no prospect that either will be developed for some years. The government is supporting research and funding a wide-ranging public education campaign to bring home the threat that AIDS poses to us all. It is essential that the message is put across clearly at every opportunity that the only way to stop AIDS spreading is for all our people to behave responsibly. I understand that you take particular exception to Mrs. Curry's reminder about good Christian people not catching the disease. She had in mind merely that for most people a responsible and caring way of life should protect them and their loved ones from the threat of AIDS in future. Thank you for taking the trouble to write about this important matter."
Can I just say
Yes.
how angry I was at the time and how angry I still am at her remark?
Now, you'd started to try and explain things to your son,
Yes.
and the time came when you had to tell him that his daddy was seriously ill and that he might die.
Yes.
And unsurprisingly, you describe him as becoming quite anxious and not wanting to be parted from his father for a
That's
period
right.
of time. John also learnt around 1992, your statement says, that he'd been infected with hepatitis C,
Yes.
but he'd been aware of non-A, non-B hepatitis and having that
He
for
had.
some years.
But I think that at that time there was the Hep C test had just come in.
So the formal diagnosis was made and he was told.
Yes.
You and he regarded it really as just one more thing because he was so ill with HIV by that stage.
He was, yes.
But for the sake of completeness, we will put up a letter that was sent to you subsequently by the UKHCDO. It's 2336008, page 2, please. And it's a letter in response, I think, to a request from you for records about batch numbers.
Yes.
And it's May 2003. It's from Dr. Hay. But it says this: much later epidemiological evidence suggests that the patients developed hepatitis C following their first exposure to concentrate, which in your husband's case was BPL concentrate in 1969. So your understanding is that John had been infected with non-A, non-B hepatitis C for many years.
Yes.
It was a relatively short period of time between John becoming seriously ill and his death.
He was losing weight and getting very tired, but I don't think he had major symptoms until he had 2 opportunist infections.
He had pneumonia.
Yes, the one that's peculiar to AIDS.
Yes. That was February 1994 when he was admitted to
Yes.
St Thomas's.
That's right.
And then at Easter of 1994, he had serious diarrhoea and sickness.
Yes.
And was admitted again.
It was, I can never say it.
Cryptosporidiosis.
Yes. Yes.
And we'll come back to that in a moment. But around this time, your father was also very ill.
Yes, he was. I think in April '93, about the year before, he'd had a major stroke and was in Ipswich Hospital. And then he was he was transferred to a hospital in the north of Suffolk, right in the wilds of Suffolk, and to a geriatric hospital, and he had another stroke there.
And your father died about 8 months before John.
Yes.
In the period prior to your father's death, you were travelling to Suffolk to visit him.
Yes.
And then coming back to London.
Yes.
And you had a particular fear in your mind at that time.
Yes.
Because John had spoken of suicide.
That's right. Yes. He'd said in the past that if things got too bad, he would inject himself with air. And because he was off work by then, but he wasn't too bad. He could just about fend for himself for a day or so, but I sometimes would have to stay overnight in my father's house when visiting him further up in Suffolk, and I didn't know when I came back what I might find.
And your fear was you might come home from visiting your dying father to find your husband having taken his own life.
I don't think John would have done it, but
you had that extra worry.
Yes. And also, can I just mention that in between my father dying and John dying, John's father died, and we went to see. John was just about able to walk then. We went to see John's father in hospital as he was dying, and John said to his father, "See you soon, Dad. See you soon, Dad."
And was that the last time he saw his father?
Yes. And they're actually they're buried together or scattered together. The ashes are scattered together.
So, after when John was in hospital for the second time around Easter 1994, you had to go and help nurse him in hospital because there weren't sufficient nursing staff to.
Well, there were nurses around, but they were busy. He needed so much attention that he wasn't getting it. To help him onto the toilet and things like that, and try and feed him. He wasn't eating much because it was coming out of different orifices. Yes.
And you had to leave your son, who was now a teenager, to fend for himself, you said, which you still feel guilty about.
Yes,
John was sent home from St Thomas's with little warning,
that's right.
and you describe he was sent home in an ambulance with other patients, and he was the last to be dropped off because you lived furthest away, so it was a long journey.
I was with him when he was actually discharged, but they wouldn't allow me to go home in the ambulance with him. And so I managed to get home. It was a long way from St Thomas's to where we lived. And he was the last one to be dropped off. And they discharged him. And when the ambulance dropped him off, he almost fell into my arms.
You had difficulty getting him upstairs.
Yes, that's right, yes.
And for the following 6 weeks, you looked after him on your own.
Yes, the doctor was supposed to, my local GP was supposed to come. He didn't come and he didn't come and he never did come. They did eventually send a nurse, but basically she just brought, I can't think what you call them, sort of nappies, not nappies, but
Pads.
Pads, that's right, for him, and that was about all. So it was and we were sleeping in the same bed because we didn't have any more room. It was hell, actually.
Eventually, nurses from the local hospice helped you nurse him for a few days at home.
Yes, that's right.
And then John was transferred to St Christopher's Hospice, which is where he'd wanted to.
Yes, although before he was discharged from St Thomas's, he had said he wanted to die in St Thomas's, but prior to that, when he was well, we had looked at a hospice.
And you visited him every day whilst he was there.
That's right, yes.
And you've said the staff there were very good.
They were wonderful.
And you were allowed to sleep there for the last 4 days?
Yes, in a bed, in the same room, yes. I didn't wash, I didn't take my clothes off, I didn't eat. I just paid attention to him.
On the last day of John's life, you say his mother was there.
Yes.
There was a nurse from St Thomas's there.
Yes, she'd recently left her job at St Thomas's, but she'd had some experience of palliative care, and she'd come along, so she was there. Yeah.
And you were there, and you say in your statement, we willed him to go, and he died
That's
peacefully.
right. Well, apparently that's what you do. Going on the advice of the nurse there, she said that was what we should do, and that's what we did.
And so John died June of 1994.
That's right, yes.
And he was just 41 years old.
That's right.
You've said in your statement that your initial emotion was a sense of relief for him that his pain was over.
That's right, yes.
But it was over the following months that things really hit you.
That's right, yes.
And you've struggled really ever since then to cope with the loss
yes.
of John. You've explained in your statement you've got to a stage where you tried to do lots of things, lots of classes, lots of courses to try and keep yourself occupied.
Yes.
But you became stressed, anxious and depressed.
Yes, I did try to go back to teaching after 18 months. I had about 2 terms. It was just a temporary post in a nursery. It all became too much. It was the day after the Dunblane incident, and I had a breakdown in the classroom in front of 25 small children, nursery children, and I never went back to teaching after that.
You did begin to see a psychologist regularly.
Yes,
You found
she's very kindly here today to support me.
And you've said you found a psychologist who was one of few who had specialist knowledge of AIDS
Yes.
and that
yes.
she was a great help to you.
She was, yes. Both before I saw her before John died and after.
But you've described in your statement the impact of losing John on your life. And if I may, I'm just going to read out a passage from your statement where you
Yes.
describe it very powerfully. You say this: "I feel I've lost so many things in my life, and the whole situation has affected me beyond measure. I have lost the love of my life and been left to bring up my son alone. I lost my career as a teacher and have not been able to work since because of bad depression. I am still devastated by not having a second child. Since my son left home, now married with 2 small children, I have lived alone. It is very lonely with only the 4 walls to talk to. There is nobody to confide in, to make me a cup of tea, or care for me when I'm ill, although my family help as much as they can and have been a great comfort, which is much appreciated. I think people must think that maybe after all these years have gone by, that I would somehow forget what had happened. In fact, John's death has permeated every area of my life and affected every area of my life. I lost the love of my life and he is not here anymore." Going to ask you about 2 further matters, Mary. Financial implications of what happened to John,
Yes.
and then some of your campaigning activities.
Okay.
As we've heard, John was only 41 when he died, and he had to give up work 2 years before, and you were unable to return to work.
Yes.
So financially, things have not been easy for you in the years that followed.
Well, it hasn't been as bad for me as a lot of other widows. I did have a pension from John because he was in work till the end of his life. Although he hadn't worked for 2 years, the firm kindly paid him. He was just about to go on half pay when he died. I had a teacher's pension. I now have state pension, old age pension. Somehow we've managed, and I've had the ex gratia payments.
And you use those to help with housing costs.
That's right, yes. I still have a mortgage, but it's an interest-free mortgage, and it's very small now. I think, as I say, I manage.
You've observed in your statement that for the first 4 or so years after John died, and your son was still under the age of 18, you received regular payments from the Macfarlane Trust, but after that, nothing.
That's right. At that time, the Macfarlane Trust only gave payments to widows with children or disabled widows.
And since that time, and since there have been means-tested schemes, you've refused to apply because you strongly disagree with the principle of means testing.
Yes, and I think most people here would agree with that.
You have received some funding from the English Infected Blood Scheme that have assisted you to recently receive counselling from the same psychologist.
That's right. And I did, last year I did receive 1 winter payment, but neither of those are means tested.
In terms of the Skipton Fund, you said you had to fight hard for those 2 payments. You were turned down 2 or 3 times, but you were eventually accepted with the help of one of the doctors from St Thomas's.
That's right. Dr. Bevan from St Thomas's helped me get stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 2 I got on the probability that John had Hep C, and we knew from the test that he had Hep C, and that he would possibly go on if the AIDS didn't get him. Well, the AIDS did get him first, but the Hep C could have been a problem for him.
You've recorded in your statement that you once went to see Martin Harvey when he first became chief executive of the Macfarlane Trust.
That's right.
To ask for regular help for all widows, not just yourself.
Yes.
And how did that conversation go?
Well, I went to see him when he first became chief executive of the Macfarlane Trust. As you say, it wasn't really for me. As much as some widows that I knew were struggling, and I thought, he's a new broom, he'll be sympathetic. Well, boy, was I wrong. He said to me, "What did your husband do?" And I said, he was an electronics engineer. And he said, "Well, don't they have some organisation or a scheme where they can help you?" And he never said anything about, the Macfarlane Trust helping me. And I was disgusted. I couldn't believe he was saying that to me.
We can see that John had been concerned about issues of financial stability and financial impact during his life, in particular life insurance and costs of treatment. And we'll look at a letter in that regard. Henry, it's 2336007, please. And it's page 6. It's a letter of the 19th of April 1988, and it's from the Department of Health and Social Security, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Health, addressed to Colin Moynihan MP. Mm-hmm. Thank you for your letter of the 1st of March about your constituent, Mr J Grindley, and his concern over the availability of life assurance for haemophiliacs infected with the human immunodeficiency virus and the funding of treatment for haemophiliacs. I'm sorry for the delay in replying. And then the first paragraph deals with the issue of insurance and says this. Decisions as to the risks undertaken by insurance companies are a matter for the commercial judgment of individual insurance companies. The government does not intervene in these decisions and recognises that insurance companies must take account of the commercial implications AIDS and HIV infection present. However, the government is in touch with the Association of British Insurers to ensure that each new application for cover is judged solely on the individual circumstances of the proposer. So pausing there, John had obviously been concerned about a difficulty or inability to get life insurance.
That's right, yes. He had been with, I think, the Prudential and had some kind of, I can't remember the exact policy, but just some kind of savings policy where, and he had a payout, and then he decided to try for life insurance, but he was turned down. I think there were questions about AIDS. I think that's why we must have written.
And then the letter goes on to say this: the provision of health services for haemophiliacs is well established and rests with individual health authorities who have a detailed knowledge of local circumstances and are therefore best placed to determine local needs and priorities. Now, as I understand it from your statement, and it may have been what prompted John's approach to the MP, John was being charged for one particular kind of drug.
Yes, he was being charged because he was still in work. He was charged for his antiviral drugs, AZT, Retrivol. He had to pay for a payment card, for prescriptions, which we were absolutely disgusted about.
And Mary, you've continued campaigning and letter writing in the years since John has died.
Yes.
And we're just going to look at, we've looked already at some of the letters sent by or in respect of matters that you raised or John raised. We're just going to look at 3 more. Henry, could we have 2336007, page 11, please? And we can see that the issue that was being raised here, it's 18th of April 1995. Dear Mrs Grindley, thank you for your letter about the hepatitis C campaign being run by the Haemophilia Society. So this is the year following John's death.
Yes.
I have much sympathy with your comments and with the points which the Society make. As you may know, the issue has already been ventilated in the House of Lords, where the Minister explained that the government does not accept liability for those infected by contaminated blood products, on the grounds that such patients received the best treatment available given the medical knowledge at that time. Whilst a parallel can be drawn with those who contracted HIV, the Minister claims that this was a special case, that the consequences are not comparable, and that agreeing to what would be in effect no-fault compensation could involve substantial expenditure, not only for those cases, but for others of a similar nature for which a precedent would have been created. However, having explained the government's stance, I do accept that there is an argument for consideration being given to ex gratia payments in certain cases, and I shall seek opportunities to raise this in the House of Commons or informally with ministers. So you were involved in trying to support a campaign for payments for those who had been infected with hepatitis C.
Yes, yes.
And then could we have, please, Henry, within the same exhibit, but page 25?
Can I just say that
Yes, of course.
this is off my own bat. Individually, I wasn't involved in any particular group at that time.
So page 25, please. We can see this is a more recent letter. It's the 19th of June 2009. And this is after Lord Archer had reported. You gave evidence to the Archer inquiry.
That's right, yes.
Again, you have written to Dawn Primarolo about the government's response to Lord Archer's report. And the letter says this: I was sorry to read of the death of your husband and that you've been affected by the issue of contaminated blood. I appreciate that this must be a difficult time for you. This government deeply regrets that patients acquired serious infections as a result of NHS treatment some 2 or more decades ago, and extends every sympathy to the patients and their families who have suffered as a result of the very treatments which should have transformed their lives for the better. The department understands the sense of grievance that some people may feel as a result of what has happened, and that there are deeply held opinions on the appropriateness and timeliness of decisions and actions taken many years ago. In his report, Lord Archer did not find the government of the day to have been at fault and did not apportion blame. The government is committed to ensuring that people with haemophilia and others who've been infected with hepatitis C and or HIV from blood and blood products are well cared for, supported in their communities, and fully informed about how best to look after their health. The government gave very careful consideration to Lord Archer's recommendations and believes its final response is as positive as possible. The government has published the final response on the Department of Health website, and then we have a link to it. This includes details of the steps taken in response to each recommendation. It's not possible to meet with the Minister, however, I hope, so owing to diary commitments, it's not possible to meet with the Minister. However, I hope this reply is helpful. You had been involved with the Archer inquiry, you gave your evidence.
Yes,
And this letter was prompted by your view that the government's response was inadequate.
yes, that's right.
And then finally, Mary, 2336007, so same exhibit, Henry, but page 28, please. We can see this is more recent still, November 2012. Again, you've written to the Department of Health, in fact, you've written to David Cameron, and the letter has been passed to the Department of Health.
Yes,
And it says this: I was very sorry to read of your husband's death. The government is deeply sorry about the events that led to the infection of so many people with HIV and hepatitis C, and has the utmost sympathy for all of those who were affected. I can assure you that the department sympathises with the distress and deep sense of injustice felt by the families of haemophilia patients infected with blood-borne viruses through their treatment. It is tragic that people were harmed because of the very treatments that were supposed to help them. And pausing there, although we don't have your letter, Mary, it seems from what follows that you were asking for a public inquiry. And it says this:
possibly. Yes, yes, I was. Yes.
It has been the view of successive governments that there is no justification for a public inquiry into these matters in England after all this time. The relevant facts already in the public domain. All relevant documents held by the Department of Health on blood safety covering the period 1970 to 1985, when the heat treatment of clotting factor products was introduced, have now been published in line with the Freedom of Information Act. If any further documents from that period come to light, the department will also publish them in line with the Freedom of Information Act. The issue now is how best to support those affected. Successive governments have recognised the plight of all those affected by NHS-supplied contaminated blood or blood products, and a number of ex gratia payment schemes have been put in place to provide financial support. To date, these schemes have paid out over £264 million. And then if we can go over the page. In January 2011, the then Secretary of State for Health, Andrew Lansley, made a statement to the House of Commons in which he said he viewed the events that led to thousands of patients contracting hepatitis C and HIV from NHS-supplied blood and blood products as one of the great tragedies of modern healthcare. He also said how sorry he was that it had happened and expressed his deep regret for the pain and misery that many have suffered as a result. Did you regard that as an adequate answer to your concerns?
Not at all, no.
Mary, it's clear from your statement and from some of the many letters you've written, and we've only touched on some of them,
Yes.
how important it's been to you to try and raise these issues, as you and John did during John's life and
Yes.
subsequently. And I just wanted to read one further bit from your statement where you address this. You say this: I felt all along that I never failed John in life, and I tried to be the best wife I could under the circumstances. I know he loved me, and he told me near the end what a good wife I had been. However, I failed him in death, because I haven't been able to get justice for him and the thousands of others who have died or are still alive, many of whom I know personally, or the widows who I know or don't know. I know that John would want me to try and be happy. He didn't want me to cry after his funeral, and I didn't, but I've cried buckets since and still do. He said when he was ill that he wanted me to grieve for him for a year and then forget him, perhaps remarry with his blessing. Well, I have learnt that is impossible. We still have no closure, no admission of wrongdoing. Everything has been swept under the carpet and no one listened. And that's one of the reasons why you have continued over these years to write these letters, raise these issues,
Yes.
because you believe that's the right way for you to
Yes.
honour John's memory.
Can I also say I did campaign over recombinant factor 8.
You did, and we have a number of those letters in the materials you've provided to the
Yes.
inquiry, and that was a very important part of
That was
your
important to
activities.
me because I wanted, you know, people to be free of viruses and things. So that's why I campaigned, and I had a question put by my MEP to the European Parliament. At the time, recombinant factor 8 had VAT on it. I don't know whether it still has, but and this is what was stopping the haemophilia centres from purchasing it. So they were still, you know, having human factor 8 in their centres because of the cost. And but the European Parliament said it was up to the British government about VAT, and the British government have said, you know, it was up to the European Parliament. So, but anyway, eventually it did come in via, first of all with Frank Thompson. I think he brought it in for children, and then subsequently it's come in.
Mary, those are the questions I have for you. I'm going to ask Mr. Williams if there's anything further he'd like me to ask. Mary, there's just one further point which Mr. Williams asks me to raise with you.
Yes.
We don't have the letters to display on screen, but we I certainly have seen them, and they've been provided by you. And it's correspondence in February of 1984. So this is after John had undertaken that form of skin testing.
Right.
And it's correspondence in which John was asked by St Thomas's to donate blood, and the letter reads: Dear Mr. Grindley, we're desperately short of haemophiliac blood at the hospital, which means that we have difficulty in monitoring operations on patients with a problem similar to yours. We would be very grateful if you could donate some of your blood to us, assuming that you have not treated yourself within the last week. And I think from memory there are 2 such requests for John to donate blood.
Could you just tell me the dates again, please?
That's the first letter is the 17th of February 1984. The second letter, I think, follows fairly shortly thereafter.
Right.
October of close to the microphone. October of 1984. Do you recall John being asked to donate blood?
Well, I don't know specific dates, but yes, he did. He because he was interested in medical research, he frequently gave blood for research at St Thomas's. But what it was for, I don't know.
Right, thank you. Mary, those are the questions, but is there something further that you would like to say?
Could I just raise, before I have got to say, the incident with Dr. Savage at St Thomas's. This was in 2003. I had requested from the National Haemophilia Database John's medical records, treatment records, for the American litigation. And the notes actually didn't come to me. I had to pick them up via St Thomas's from Dr. Savage. And Dr. Savage had a big row with me in the reception room, reception at the Haemophilia Centre. He didn't want me to have the notes. Eventually he did give them to me. But when he gave them to me, he said, these are possibly not accurate anyway. What he meant by that, I'm not quite sure, whether he was hiding something from me, or he possibly thought I was going to sue him, which I wasn't. But I did get the notes eventually, and it really did have a very strong effect on me. I ran into the toilets at St Thomas's and cried.
And those were treatment records from the National Haemophilia Database, as you've explained.
Yes.
Previously, you'd actually approached St Thomas's and asked for copies of John's records.
Yes.
And you were told that it was all too long ago and they'd been destroyed.
That's right. I did get his ordinary medical records, but not the treatment records.
Mary, there was something further I think you want to say.
Yes, if you wouldn't mind. Some of this has been repeated. About a year after my husband died, I went to the GP because I was very depressed, and this was before my breakdown. He was very unhelpful and more or less told me to get over what happened and move on in a cold, very cold manner. A few friends and relatives have told me since to my face that this happened all long ago and I should move on. But how can I? I live with it every day. On the surface, I may appear that I've moved on. I'm known for my smile, but underneath I haven't, and I don't think I ever will. I have many activities, feel I'm very popular and well-liked. I enjoy socialising and I have plenty of friends, both ones who know my situation and those who don't. But I also have had deep periods of deep depression and loneliness, and even at times I've had suicidal thoughts. There have been and still are days when I have had to force myself out of bed, where I don't wash all day. I sit around in my underwear and my nightwear with the curtains closed. I have been under a wonderful clinical psychologist who's here today for the past 18 months, who I was seeing before John died, and she is currently seeing me through this very difficult time, and I'm sure beyond. And I thank her for all her support. My son has also suffered greatly, going into denial and not knowing how to deal with what happened, with no father and a mother who was stricken with grief. He has only just started to open up to me this week by allowing me to read his witness statement. I hope now, after more than 25 years, we can begin to talk about what has happened more openly. I am just one of thousands of people who have suffered from this dreadful tragedy. Indeed, as we know, thousands have died, and those left and their families have been left to endure horrendous physical and mental pain and suffering. What is more, they have been left without help or no help, having to be means-tested and begging for money. The widows, some of whom I know, have been, and some of whom have been tragically infected themselves, have been made to feel like second-class citizens, scroungers, and treated worse than dogs and left to survive themselves. Yet all this should never have happened, and what has happened until now has been swept under the carpet and truths denied. I have, in a small way, been a little voice battling against the odds through nearly 40 years by my individual campaigning, trying to halt unsuccessfully the use of unsuitable donors from American prisons and homeless. Still, the pharmaceutical companies continued to send out untreated blood products, even when they knew heat-treated blood was available for their profit. And the American government still allowed them to do it. And I tried to halt the importation of those blood products. I wrote to Margaret Thatcher, Kenneth Clarke and others who deliberately ignored what was happening, and to successive governments who ignored pleas for help and never accepted responsibility, which was really their duty of care to the haemophilia community. But those letters fell on deaf ears. I battled with the McFarlane Trust to try to get regular payments for all widows, but to no avail. I also campaigned for recombinant factor VIII, but initially it was too expensive for haemophilia centres because of the VAT, and then only given eventually to children. I promised my husband when he was very ill that I would seek justice for him. Until now, my efforts have been in vain. Although I feel I did all I could while he was alive, I feel I have failed him in death because I have not been able to get the justice for him and all the others who so tragically died or have been infected or affected. I will fight on. I am extremely grateful for this opportunity to give my evidence. We all hope Sir Brian and his wonderful team will finally uncover the truth by this public inquiry, and I thank them for all their hard work. I just hope, as we all do, that the government will be listening to these findings and act accordingly to give all those infected and affected some closure, and that we might finally get some closure that we have been denied. I would like to thank my wonderful daughter-in-law here for all her help with my witness statement and for being here at my side, for my wonderful son who has supported me through many difficult years, my friends and family here today, Lynn Kelly from Haemophilia Wales, who has supported me both before the public inquiry and since, and who's worked tirelessly to help bring this public inquiry together with others. I would like to thank the staff at Watkins and Gunn, particularly Michael Imperato, Lucy O'Brien and Megan Rogers, and my barristers Lloyd and Christian for their tireless work on my behalf. And very lastly, I would like to pay tribute to all those infected and affected who have given their evidence and or their witness statement to this inquiry. They have shown great courage to do so. I have met some amazing people, both before and during this inquiry. They are forever in my heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Sir Brian.
We have ended this stage of the inquiry on a very powerful note. Not only powerful for your own story without the documents, but all the more so for the way it has been methodically documented almost at every stage. And I can only thank you for that. I would comment that those of us who've listened to you may perhaps reflect on your saying that haemophiliacs, in your experience, are people with real strength.
That's right.
They may reflect that people who marry them also have real strength.
I think that's why we chose haemophiliacs. Because of
And
their...
you're fighting on.
Yeah, I am fighting on, Sir Brian.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.